Empires don't collapse the way movies show them. There is no single explosion, no final speech, no clear moment when the world suddenly realizes everything has changed. Instead, the collapse begins after the final stage is reached, when power still exists, but no longer works the way it used to. This is the moment history rarely explains clearly, because most people focus on the rise of empires, or the dramatic moment of their fall. But the most important chapter comes after the final stage, when systems stop functioning, when authority weakens without disappearing, and when ordinary people begin to feel the consequences long before historians name the event. Rome reached this moment, Britain reached it, the Soviet Union reached it, and every time, the same questions appeared. What happens to money? What happens to order? What happens to everyday life? Who fills the vacuum when power fades? This documentary answers those questions, not with predictions, not with politics, but with patterns repeated again and again across centuries. Because after an empire reaches the final stage, history does not improvise. It follows a script. So, what does this script look like? We're going to dive into the forgotten patterns of history, exploring the phase that is often overlooked but holds the most crucial lessons. This isn't just about emperors and armies. It's about the very fabric of society unraveling. Think about it. What happens when your money starts losing its value overnight? Or when the laws that once protected you suddenly become meaningless? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They are historical realities that have played out time and again. We'll examine the fall of Rome, not just the sacks and the battles, but the decades leading up to it. We'll look at how daily life changed for the average Roman citizen, how local strongmen began to replace central authority, and how the economic system slowly ground to a halt. Then, we'll jump forward to the British Empire. How did the world's largest empire simply fade away? We'll uncover the economic strains and the subtle shifts in global power that made its dominance unsustainable long before the flags came down. And of course, we'll look at the more recent collapse of the Soviet Union. Many of us remember the images of the Berlin Wall coming down, but the real story began years earlier, in the breadlines, in the failing factories, and in the growing disconnect between the government's promises and the people's reality. By comparing these vastly different empires, we can identify a universal blueprint for decline. This series is designed to give you a new lens through which to view history, and perhaps, our present. We're not here to spread fear, but to equip you with knowledge. By understanding the patterns, the script that history follows, we can better understand the forces shaping our own world. We'll explore the signs, the stages, and the human responses to systemic failure. What happens to trust? Who steps up when the old leaders fail? And what new systems emerge from the ashes? Join us as we decode the final stage of empire. This is a journey through history you haven't seen before. What's the first thing that disappears when an empire enters its final stage? You might think it's territory, or the army, or even the government itself. But history tells us it's something far more subtle and far more powerful. It's confidence. The confidence people have in the future. The confidence they have in stability. The simple, taken for granted belief that tomorrow will look a lot like today. Let's look at ancient Rome. Towards the end, the outward signs of the empire were still there. People still paid their taxes. The Senate continued to meet. The mighty Roman legions still marched. But underneath the surface, a silent and profound shift was happening. Merchants stopped making long-term investments. Why risk capital on a project that might not be there in 10 years? Wealthy landowners began to hide their assets, converting them into portable forms or burying them on their estates. Ordinary citizens started planning for a future of uncertainty, not a future of growth. This erosion of confidence is a quiet killer. It changes how everyone behaves, long before any laws are rewritten or borders redrawn. The questions people ask themselves change. It's no longer, how can I build and grow? Instead, it becomes, how do I protect what I already have? Or, how can I move my wealth somewhere safer? Or, how do I stay flexible and ready for anything? We see this pattern again and again. In the late Roman Empire, gold coins, which had circulated freely for centuries, suddenly vanished. People weren't spending them. They were hoarding them. It was a private vote of no confidence in the state's economic future. Fast forward to the final decades of the British Empire. Capital started flowing out of Britain, not to reinvest in the empire's industries or infrastructure, but to find safer havens in other countries. And in the last years of the Soviet Union, citizens placed far more trust in their personal networks and the black market than they did in any official state promises. In all these cases, money got nervous. And why does this matter so much? Because empires aren't just held together by military force or political structures. They're held together by shared expectations. The expectation that your contracts will be honored. The expectation that institutions will function properly tomorrow. The expectation that the sacrifices you make today will lead to a better future for you and your family. Once that fundamental belief starts to crack, the whole system becomes brittle. Even the most powerful and seemingly stable empires start to behave like fragile ones, because the invisible glue that held them together, the collective confidence in the future, has dissolved. The structure might still be standing, but its foundations have already crumbled away. When you lose faith in money, something fundamental changes. It's not a sudden crash, but a slow, creeping decay in your character and the character of a nation. Take the Roman Empire. Their silver coins, the denarii, started to contain less and less actual silver. Gold coins were subtly clipped at the edges. The government swore everything was fine, that the value was the same. But the markets, the everyday people buying bread and oil, knew better. Prices crept up, while wages stayed flat. The trust was broken. The money was no longer real. Fast forward to Britain after World War II. The pound sterling, once the world's reserve currency, lost its throne. The institutions were still there. The influence hadn't vanished overnight. But the currency no longer commanded global respect. This forced Britain into a series of painful choices: biting austerity, devaluing their own money, and becoming reliant on others for financial stability. It was a long, hard road down from the top. Then there's the Soviet Union. Towards the end, money became almost a joke. The real currency wasn't the ruble. It was favors, connections, who you knew. The official economy was a facade, while the real one operated in the shadows. A complex web of informal exchanges just to get by. When money reaches this final stage, it stops being a measure of value and becomes a desperate tool for survival. This is when you start to hear about inflation being structural, as if it's just a permanent feature of life. You see bizarre asset bubbles, where prices for things like houses or stocks detach from any real-world productivity. Wealth concentrates at the very top or flees the country entirely, and ordinary people feel poorer, even if official numbers claim the economy is growing. Empires in this late stage are experts at projecting an image of prosperity. They'll point to grand new projects and booming markets, but this prosperity is fragile, uneven, and feels abstract to most. The state can still spend, and markets can still operate, but the deep, unspoken trust in money as a stable store of value is gone. And here's the critical lesson. Once that credibility is lost, everything else becomes harder to maintain. Social cohesion, political stability, long-term planning, it all rests on a foundation of trust in our money. When that foundation cracks, the entire structure begins to wobble. We often imagine collapse as a sudden blackout, a moment where power just vanishes. But history tells a very different story. It's not about absence, it's about fragmentation. When a great power enters its final stage, it doesn't just disappear. Instead, its authority shatters into 1,000 pieces. Take the Roman Empire. As Rome weakened, power didn't evaporate. It simply moved. Local governors started acting like kings in their own provinces. Private armies, loyal only to their commanders, replaced the central legions. People's allegiance shifted from the abstract idea of the empire to the very real protector who could keep their family safe. We see this pattern again and again. Look at the British Empire. As its global influence waned, colonial administrators on the ground began making their own rules. Local elites in far-flung territories had more say in what happened than London did. Power wasn't just held by the government anymore. It was scattered across different institutions, each pulling in its own direction. And then there's the Soviet Union. When the center couldn't hold, regional leaders who were once just puppets suddenly gained real, tangible power. They started ignoring directives from Moscow. Informal networks and personal loyalties became more important than the official chain of command. An underground economy became the real economy. This moment of fragmentation is crucial to understand. It feels like total chaos, like everything is falling apart. But what's really happening is reorganization. It's a messy, often painful, but natural process. When people can no longer trust the big, central authority, they don't give up on structure entirely. They just look for it on a smaller, more reliable scale. They turn to local community leaders, private institutions, or even informal neighborhood networks. The old empire might still exist in name, its flag might still fly, but it no longer has a monopoly on power. And this stage can last a surprisingly long time. Rome was still Roman for centuries after its power had fragmented. People still called themselves Romans, even as they lived under the rule of a local warlord. Britain remained a major global player long after its imperial role had truly faded. So, the real danger isn't necessarily a sudden, dramatic collapse. It's the prolonged instability that comes with fragmentation. It's the long, uncertain period where the old system is gone, but the new one hasn't fully taken shape yet. Understanding this helps us see the world not as ending, but as constantly changing. Have you ever wondered what really happens when a great empire starts to crumble? It's not just about grand battles or political drama. The most overlooked truth is this: ordinary people, people like you and me, adapt long before governments even realize there's a problem. When the big systems fail to respond, individuals step up and fill the gaps. Think about late Rome. As the currency became worthless, people went back to bartering. When the legions could no longer protect the borders, local communities organized their own security. Family networks became the new public services. It wasn't a conscious revolution. It was just people doing what they needed to do to get by. We saw a different version of this in Britain after its imperial era. The global empire was gone, but the nation didn't just disappear. Citizens adjusted their expectations. They rebuilt their social systems on a smaller, more local scale. The focus shifted from projecting power across the world to building a welfare state at home. It was a massive, quiet adaptation. And what about the Soviet Union? As the state-controlled economy faltered, informal economies blossomed. Black markets, run by regular people, were what actually fed the cities. Who you knew and the personal relationships you had became far more important than official ideology. Again, it was adaptation from the ground up, a response to a system that was no longer working for them. In this final stage of decline, survival becomes a personal mission. People stop asking, "What will the empire do for me?" and start asking, "What can I do for myself and my community?" This incredible human capacity for adaptation is what prevents an immediate, catastrophic collapse. It's the glue that holds things together when the official structures are falling apart. But here's the twist. This very same adaptation also weakens the central authority even further. Because once people learn to survive, and even thrive without the empire, they stop seeing a reason to defend it. They've already moved on. The empire becomes a hollow shell, not because it was conquered, but because its own people learned to live without it. It's a powerful lesson from history about resilience, community, and the quiet, unstoppable power of ordinary people. History never leaves a vacuum. When a great empire finally reaches its end and starts to crumble, something new always rises to take its place. Sometimes this happens quietly, with new ideas and cultures slowly taking root. Other times, it's a loud, aggressive takeover. Think about it. What happened after the Roman Empire fell? The old order didn't just vanish into thin air. Germanic kingdoms carved out new territories across Europe. The Church stepped in, becoming a massive stabilizing force that held society together. And where people once called themselves Roman, new regional identities, like Frankish or Visigothic, began to form. The idea of Rome was replaced, not erased. Fast forward a few centuries, when the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never set, began its decline. Who filled the void? The United States emerged as a new global superpower. New financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF were created, fundamentally reshaping the global economy. Power didn't collapse, it was reorganized. The headquarters just moved across the Atlantic. And what about the fall of the Soviet Union in our own lifetimes? It was a seismic event. Suddenly, the bipolar world was gone. Regional powers, once overshadowed by Moscow, began asserting their influence. New alliances like NATO expanded, and economic power shifted rapidly as former Soviet states opened up to the world. It was a messy, chaotic, and incredibly fast-paced transformation. This transition from one power to the next is never clean. It's never a simple case of one empire closing its doors on Friday and a new one opening for business on Monday. Old systems, old habits, and old loyalties linger for a long time. New systems overlap with them, creating a period of confusion and uncertainty. People are often caught between the world that was and the world that is, struggling to be born. But this confusion also creates immense opportunity. It's a moment when the rules are rewritten, when new ideas can flourish, and when fortunes can be made and lost. That's why these periods, right after an empire's final stage, are remembered as being so unstable, but also so incredibly transformative. It's not the end of history. It's just the start of a brand new chapter, being written in real time. Ever wonder what happens to money when an empire starts to crumble? It's not like the movies where cash suddenly becomes worthless paper overnight. The reality is far more subtle and, frankly, more interesting. Money doesn't just collapse, it resets, and this reset can happen in a few different ways. Sometimes it's a massive devaluation, or a brand new currency gets introduced. Other times, a nation's money loses its global dominance, or new, parallel systems start popping up alongside the old one. Let's look at ancient Rome. The empire didn't fall because of one bad batch of coins. Instead, the gradual debasement of currency, mixing less and less silver into the coins, slowly taught citizens a hard lesson. Do untrust the money from the top. While the state kept minting coins, people started hoarding real gold and silver as private assets. For everyday trade, they went back to bartering or using trusted local IOUs. The government even started demanding taxes in the form of goods, like grain or livestock, because they knew their own coins were losing value. The money was still there, but the belief in it was gone. Fast forward to the British Empire. Their reset was much quieter. The pound sterling didn't disappear, but it did lose its title as the world's #1 currency. For Britain, this meant a tough new reality. Suddenly, imported goods became much more expensive. The average person's standard of living had to adjust downwards, and Britain's global influence shifted away from its government and towards powerful financial institutions that were now dominated by other nations. The British people felt this change in their daily lives, in the price of food and fuel, long before the history books ever gave it a name. Then there's the Soviet Union, a really extreme case. Towards the end, official money became almost meaningless. The prices listed in stores meant nothing because the shelves were empty. What really determined value was availability. If you could get your hands on something, that was real wealth. After the collapse, new currencies sprang up almost overnight, and people adapted to this new reality much faster than the new governments could even write the rules. So, what's the pattern here? In the final stage of an empire, the money itself might survive, but the trust in it doesn't. And once that trust is gone, the way people think about and use money changes forever. It's a fundamental shift in economic behavior, a lesson repeated throughout history. One of the biggest fears when we talk about empires falling is the idea of total, absolute chaos. We imagine a world plunged into darkness, where all rules disappear and society just crumbles. But what if I told you that history paints a very different picture? What if the story isn't about the end of order, but about its transformation? Let's look at the Roman Empire. As its vast imperial power weakened, it's true that the emperor's laws lost their reach, but order didn't vanish. It just got smaller, more local. Village leaders and community elders stepped up, enforcing local rules and customs that made sense for their specific areas. Church authority began to fill the void left by the state, providing a new moral and social framework. When public policing faltered, people found new ways to protect themselves through private arrangements and community militias. Order didn't disappear. It shrank and reorganized itself around the immediate needs of the people. Fast forward to the British Empire. As its global influence faded, did Britain itself descend into anarchy? Not at all. In fact, you could argue the opposite happened. The immense resources, the money, the manpower, the administrative focus that were once used to manage a sprawling network of colonies were redirected back home. Domestic order actually intensified. National institutions, from the government to the military, adapted to their new, smaller role. The focus shifted from projecting power outward to strengthening society inward. And what about a more recent example? The collapse of the Soviet Union. For a brief moment, it looked like the ultimate fracture of order. But new structures emerged with surprising speed. Local governments, long overshadowed by Moscow, started making their own decisions. New legal systems were built from the ground up to replace the old communist framework. And where formal systems were slow to catch on, informal networks and local power brokers stepped in to enforce a kind of street-level stability. The myth of total chaos after an empire's fall completely ignores one fundamental human trait: our incredible adaptability. At our core, most people crave stability far more than any grand ideology. We want to know our families are safe and that there are rules to live by. So when one system fails, we don't just throw up our hands and give in to anarchy. we instinctively start building another one. Order isn't a fragile vase that shatters forever. It's more like water. It changes shape and finds a new container. Here's a hard truth about history. The elite are rarely the first to suffer. When empires start to crumble, the wealthy and powerful have an escape plan. It's a pattern we've seen time and time again. In any declining power, whether it's an ancient empire or a modern superpower, the sequence is disturbingly similar. First, the wealthy groups quietly start moving their assets to safer havens. Their influence shifts behind the scenes, securing private protection and new opportunities elsewhere. They build their lifeboats long before anyone else even smells the rain. The real cost, the heavy price of decline, is always paid by ordinary people. Think about the fall of Rome. It wasn't the senators who immediately felt the sting. It was the small farmers who lost their land to consolidated estates. It was the urban workers who lost their jobs and security as the economy faltered. The dream of social mobility, it collapsed, leaving generations trapped. Fast forward to the decline of the British Empire after World War II. The working class saw their living standards plummet. Rationing, which was supposed to be a temporary wartime measure, dragged on for years. The nation's global prestige vanished, replaced by a grim reality of austerity. The average person's world shrank dramatically. Or consider the collapse of the Soviet Union. Imagine waking up one day to find your life savings had evaporated into thin air. The guarantee of a job, a cornerstone of the Soviet system, was gone. In its place, crime and a terrifying sense of uncertainty rose. For millions, the future they had been promised simply disappeared overnight. This brings us to the final, most painful stage, the breaking of the social contract. This is the moment when the majority of people realize that the promises they built their lives on, work hard, follow the rules, and you'll have a stable life, were only temporary. They were conditional. This realization is a bitter pill to swallow. It creates deep resentment, a feeling of being left behind and betrayed. But it also fosters a cold, hard realism. It's the understanding that you can't always rely on the system to protect you. It's a wake-up call that forces people to look at the world, not as they wish it were, but as it actually is. History teaches us that stability is fragile, and that when things fall apart, the burden is rarely shared equally. Understanding this pattern isn't about being cynical. It's about being prepared and aware. Have you ever wondered who really pays the price when a great power falls? Here's a harsh truth. The elite are rarely the first to suffer. In every empire, from ancient Rome to the modern era, the story is the same. The wealthy move their assets long before the crash. The influential quietly shift their power. The well-connected secure their protection behind closed doors. The real cost, the crushing weight of decline, always falls on the shoulders of ordinary people. Think about the fall of Rome. It wasn't the senators who lost everything overnight. It was the small farmers, driven from their land. It was the urban workers, whose security vanished. The ladder of social mobility simply collapsed. Or consider the British Empire after the World Wars. While the aristocracy may have felt a pinch, it was the working class whose living standards plummeted. Rationing dragged on for years, and the promise of imperial glory was replaced by a grim reality of austerity. And what about the collapse of the Soviet Union? Millions saw their life savings evaporate. The guarantee of a job disappeared, replaced by rampant unemployment. Crime soared, and a deep sense of uncertainty took hold. For everyday citizens, the world they knew was gone. When an empire enters its final stage, the social contract shatters. People wake up and realize that the promises they built their lives on, stability, security, a better future for their children, were only temporary. This realization breeds resentment, but it also forces a painful, necessary realism. So, what happens after the fall? Recovery isn't about going back to the way things were. It's about total redefinition. Rome didn't recover as the Roman Empire. It transformed into the fragmented, localized world of medieval Europe. Britain didn't get its empire back. It had to redefine itself as a European nation-state. The Soviet Union didn't just bounce back. Its successor states had to forge entirely new identities and paths. True recovery requires accepting a new, often smaller, scale. It demands the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust from the ground up and forging a completely new sense of who we are. History shows that empires desperately clinging to their past glory only fail faster. It's the ones that accept the painful reality of transformation that ultimately find a way to survive and build something new. History's final lesson is uncomfortable. Empires don't fall because people rebel. They fall because their systems outgrow reality. Think about it. After the final stage, power lingers for a while, but influence fades. Control starts to fragment, and life just adjusts. The world doesn't end, it just changes hands. Those who understand this pattern early suffer a lot less than those who spend their energy denying it. History doesn't punish empires, it simply replaces them. In our next documentary, we're going to explore how new world orders are built, and why that transition period is always the most dangerous. You won't want to miss this, so make sure you're subscribed.